Hello, and welcome to a Thursday Toast special, which I'm recording on a Friday evening because, yeah. Um, the subject that I'm going to go through uh, is I was going to say fan. Let's go with viewer request from Stafford Thompson. So I will disappear for a second whilst I put up roughly what the question is. So, something along the lines of what was life like for a common person living in I'll go with a pre-modern era description, if they lived in the countryside or in a city, and how is that different from being a sailor at the time? And, particularly, I think we're looking at the kind of the kind of the what's the right way of putting it? The long 18th century, uh, terrible phrase, um, era of the kind of greatness of the Royal Navy. So this is going to be a very uh, minim. Right, this is tricky. It's a huge topic. Um, I kind of had in my mind thinking of trying to focus on health, but that just isn't enough. Um, so bear with me whilst I try to, frankly, more explain why this is such a difficult thing to address. Um, so, so, where to begin? Um, we're basically dealing with a pre-modern era. So, I started thinking about this, and I kind of wanted to do. There's the where and how to divide this is really tricky. Um, Part of me wanted to try and lump things together and say there's a big medieval era, which is then subdivided. And actually, I was going to have medieval running up until the middle of the 18th century almost, which is a little bit left field. But particularly from a kind of, if you're a peasant, terrible word, we'll come on to that. Uh, uh, if you're a someone who's uh, uh, the essence is, because I'm thinking of this from a health point of view, it's really the time before we even begin to have modern conceptions of health. So you're still very much guided by the four humours model: your blood, uh, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So that's where somebody is choleric, not cleric. That's a class of character in Dungeons and Dragons. Choleric, which is uh, yellow bile. You get people who are phlegmatic, and so on. Melancholy. These are all to do with the four humours model. God help us. Um, so, to a large extent, healthcare doesn't really change, but there are some big social changes, especially according to what's going to happen if you're urban versus non-urban. It's worth saying that until you get well, what I was taught in school for history, which may or may not be stand up to the rigor of actually being examined too closely, is that until you get to the agricultural and then industrial revolution in Britain, so this is going to be very British centric, possibly even English centric. within Britain, when at the times when Britain is a bit more divided than it might not otherwise be. What you're kind of looking at is um, a vastly rural population. Um, Between 80 and 90% of the population do not live in the big towns and cities. And that's true from pre-Roman invasion and sort of conquest, Roman, early post-Roman, what one quite nice historian described as the Arthurian age. Or you can call it kind of the Anglo-Saxon era, but I believe that that term has kind of been hijacked by some deeply unpleasant people, more in the US or other side of the Atlantic than in Britain, but I'm sort of going to try and steer clear of it as a term, but I also want to explain that to an English audience who are used to using that term. So, so you get them, or you could call it a kind of early Germanicization, perhaps, because these are Germanic peoples, and then you get a later wave of kind of more broadly Germanic peoples, which are also known as the Vikings, coming along. And then you get the Normans arriving in 1066-ish. And in a lot of ways, I think from almost the start of agriculture, whenever that happened in Britain, as opposed to Middle East, where well, I would imagine that it originated in the Middle East to then spread to Britain. It may well have cropped up in several places simultaneously. I think arguments also about the Indus Valley in China and would have then also developed in various places in the Americas and other places that were cut off for tens of thousands of years from kind of the big Eurasian continent. So, who knows? Not relevant. So what I'm kind of talking about is that from pretty much year dot to the Black Death, life is pretty samey, I think, if you're a common man. The elites will see a lot of change, potentially, but you are going to be there. You're going to be almost completely a subsistence farmer. You are going to have a local overlord of some sort. You don't live on a farm in the middle of nowhere. You live in a kind of little villagey thing, and then the farms radiate out kind of, and you may well have kind of a different system of fields where there are kind of huge fields, and you'll have your bit within a huge field rather than a kind of separated fields with fences or hedges between them. So all those hedgerows, yeah, not actually quite so ancient. But this is really not my area of expertise, and I'm really kind of just generalizing to try and put things in context. So the Black Death comes along. Now that is properly devastating, and it's the first massive plague like that of any sort, pandemic, with such a high mortality rate for quite a long time for the for Britain, at least England. And it creates huge social change, for good or ill at this point. It just does. And so you're looking at having huge disruption to kind of urban and rural life, because you're just losing huge numbers of your farmers. You're losing huge numbers of tradespeople. So there are new opportunities, but equally there may now not be the population to actually work the land. So this is one of the times or ways in which you can see an even bigger rise in sheep farming. You get the whatever we're going to call them, the common people. There really isn't a comfortable term for them. The common folk are looking at having a newfound sense of having the option of moving somewhere else and changing. Suddenly they are a more precious commodity. The agricultural labourer, who is often viewed as the lowest of the low, and I believe a fair number of my ancestors were. We don't really know their names because they were mostly illiterate. And they also seem to have had the same names as well, which makes it harder to trace them in some ways, weirdly. Anyway, so these agricultural labourers at this point, suddenly, instead of being very much tied to the land because they are dependent on a relatively small portion of land that they are kind of allowed to have by whoever's in charge, which really doesn't matter whether they are a Celt, a Roman, a Romano-Brit, a post-Romano-Brit, somebody a bit Germanic, somebody a bit differently Germanic, somebody kind of Franco-Norman Viking-ish, or what? Doesn't really matter. They're kind of, they don't. They may well not speak the same language. It's kind of a question of, do they speak the same language as you or not? That's the main thing. Main difference. They're going to be walking around. They're going to have a sword. You probably won't. And if they don't like you, they will hit you with the sword. And you will then do some dying. Anyway. I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that that creates some degree of change, and where you were very tied to this, to the land that you worked, and that actually includes in towns to some extent, because actually you'd often have a garden or something, probably more like an allotment, where you would be trying to grow as much of your own food as you could. So you had a secure food supply and fresh greens and things rather than having to buy them. And a garden is apparently a plot of land that you don't use a plow on, you turn the earth over in different ways, and that's apparently the difference between a market garden and a field, apparently. So you get some change, and the same will be true in towns. Sorry. So the towns represent a very small percentage of the population, because with everyone being virtually just a subsistence farmer, they can't support all that many other people on the backs of their labour. So whilst if you're a country-born common folk person, and you decide to run away to the big city, which these days would, probably not necessarily be counted as a big city in terms of population size. But if you decide to go away to go somewhere else because you think things are just so rubbish, or because too many of you survived, then there's not necessarily going to be a huge amount of work for you there, because it's fairly small and it's kind of a bit of a self-sustaining thing, and there just isn't this degree of social mobility. So although the Black Death was properly horrific, I mean, the population losses are insane. The kind of averaging says things like, 25% of the population, but that's not evenly spread. So you're going to have whole areas wiped out, and you're going to have um, areas which might not do so badly, and that's just kind of fluke, and it might be to do with which strain turns up in their area because it's going to be mutating, although it's not going to have antibiotic resistance. And for what it's worth, Black Death we're pretty sure is Yersinia pestis, which still exists today, and seems to there's reasons, and it may well have to do with the Mongol hordes as to why it came along. I think that's really cool. So yeah, but it's not really the thing I'm talking about here. If you want a video on that, I'm very happy to do that one, but at the moment I'm kind of concentrating on this. But doing something like the plague really is the sort of thing which I'd more had in mind for this. Sorry, I've gone through and tried to write some notes to keep myself on track. You can tell how well I'm doing with that. So you're going to have the changes from the Black Death, and then repopulating and things. But there are some things that aren't going to change throughout the entirety of this period, really. You know, you're looking at them until, I mean, it might change a bit in the Victorian-ish type era, maybe. Smallpox, really grim. One of only 2 diseases to be genuinely eradicated from the planet. There are apparently 2 places with viral samples left. They are secret locations, unbelievably high security labs, one in somewhere in the US and one somewhere in Russia, which are basically there. I think there is an element of it being to do with mutually assured destruction in terms of use of biological weapons, frankly. I don't know what research they're doing on it. They may be doing none. It may just be sitting frozen in, liquid nitrogen, or they may be doing stuff to it. They're not telling us. I'm quite happy with that. Hopefully it is gone forever. That is one disease I don't want to see back. It had a high mortality rate. A lot of people were scarred by it. So mortality rates, never know quite what people who are watching. That's just the percentage of people who get it who die. Another term sometimes used is case fatality rate. Yeah, so you get these sorts of numbers. So it's, put it this way, it's a lot worse than COVID. And it's incredibly infectious. Ask the Mesoamericans natives. Oh no, wait, you can't. They were pretty much wiped out by it. So that's around. Interestingly, syphilis, another big disease. That one's actually still around. Syphilis. That one only seems to turn up almost exactly when Christopher Columbus goes over to South America. But because we don't necessarily have access to all that many sets of historic remains from South America pre-Columbus to see if it was endemic in the population there, or whether it's just happens to have been a mutation, whether that mutation and new route of transmission happened in the Americas or in Europe, I don't know, but it was first noted just around 1492 to 1500 in Italy, which was heavily involved in fighting with Spain and Portugal and everything else, and amongst soldiers. So syphilis is there, and that's around a lot. TB, again, that's still around. Things which hopefully we don't have these days are a maternal mortality rate that varies according to quite how you look at these things. It's one way of looking at it is it's 1 in 50, whether you want to call it pregnancies or deliveries, will kill the mother. That's a bit of a gamble, but as a consequence of a bit of unprotected, bearing in mind there is no protected sex. Also, think about all those women you read about in history who had sort of 10, 12 pregnancies. That's 1 in 50 adding up. This is why there are so many second wives, third wives, fourth wives by people. Equally, some of the women have 3, 4, 5, 6 husbands that we know of. Catherine Parr, who was the 6th wife of Henry VIII. He was her 3rd out of 4 husbands. And who was the other one? Bess of Hardwick is another one who ended up with quite a number of different marriages going through time. So that could happen on either side. And sadly, if the maternal mortality rates aren't bad enough, and that's generally from a combination of hemorrhage, so bleeding, and infection. Particularly, they called it childbed fever. And yeah, it's not good. And the kind of, I almost don't want to call it a mortality rate. That the rates of the children not surviving, everything from not surviving the birth itself, so what these days we would probably call a stillbirth, going right the way through to age of 5 or so. Rates of childhood deaths were just horrific. And I suppose if you think about how many young children, get a bit of a diarrheal illness, bit of D&V, get dehydrated today and might need a drip. I think I did when I was about that sort of age. It's, I think, the only time I've spent a night in the hospital, or more than a night in the hospital, when it's not been because I'm working or something. Was when I was young like that, and I might well have died at that point had it been a couple of 100 years before. Since then, I'm now, touch wood, 39 and doing fine. So these things are, but that's the kind of thing that we're looking at with this. So somebody I was listening to, and I can't for the life of me remember who it was, put it really beautifully, that actually there's often an assumption that people didn't love their children in those days, or at least as much, because of the hugely high infant mortality rates and things. I heard an argument, actually, maybe they loved them more because there was a much higher chance that the child wouldn't be there in the morning, so when you kissed them goodnight. And it was just unpredictable for them, which is just horrific. Sorry, this wasn't meant to be quite so depressing. This is kind of not what I'm talking about, but this is the era we're talking about. These are the life experiences we're talking about. These are the some of these things, being royalty, being noble, wouldn't protect you. Some of them you are going to be more at risk of by being poor, because the chances of you having a bad harvest and ending up a bit malnourished and so more vulnerable to disease is that much higher. Because this is an era when most people died from infection and things, and this is something which we are hopefully getting to the stage of pulling everyone on this planet out of. As kind of a phase of development. because one of the big developments that are going to make huge changes to this are going to be the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and kind of the invention of modern hygiene, and sewerage and clean drinking water. So, just sticking with the medical side of things, in this sort of era of so if we go with kind of up to the end of the Tudor period ish, and I'll explain why I say that, you get but also when to say this is happening. So you have a number of different professions for looking after your health. At the placing themselves at the top, you have the physicians. They are notable for university education. Their services are extremely expensive. They are completely useless at this stage. The models of healthcare they are using are totally unlike our own. They would happily use astrology to work out what is wrong with you according to the alignment of the planets and the stars. At the time when your symptoms started, they would then work out what was wrong with you in terms of the imbalance of these four humours, which might well mean that they would seek to purge you, which is a lovely way of saying they're going to either get you puking your guts up or they're going to give you so many enemas that you will never feel so empty. Or they will bleed you, because that was thought to be a good idea. I can think of two illnesses where I might think of, in the modern era where we might bleed somebody. They were not thinking of those things as the reason they were doing it. So, physician, expensive, posh. As a common person, you are not going to see them. And actually, if you do see one of them, you probably want to run away, because they'll probably be like Edward Jenner and want to use you for dubiously ethical experiments where they will try and give you smallpox to see if vaccination works, because that's good. So physician, then you get the surgeons. Now, they're actually barber surgeons. Now, what does that mean? That basically means they're kind of quite good with their hands, and have a steady hand generally. So they'll turn that hand to any number of things. They will bleed you or cut you open and perform surgery. So if you get an arrow sticking through you, they will be the ones who will come and cut it out. They're not necessarily university educated. It's often more of an apprenticeship. They will give you a shave and haircut. So barber surgeons. And they might pull your teeth. And some, actually, across almost all of these things, you'll also get bone setters, people who will fix broken bones with splints and things. That's kind of differentish. Third group are apothecaries. They seem to have, for the most part, been a bit of a mix between a pharmacist and maybe a GP. Again, an apprenticeship model. And they have they kind of have a role of preparing medications that a physician might prescribe, and also you could go to them directly to ask them for treatments for various things. Um, if you're lucky, they will give you something like morphine dissolved in a bit of alcohol, because at least that's probably going to distract you from whatever the hell's wrong with you. Pretty much everything else any of these people are doing is not going to be good. I mean, surgery might be needed, but the physicians are truly useless. Um, the apothecaries are probably going to are more likely to say something that will either do nothing or will poison you and make you worse. And the surgeons, yeah. Now, those three groups are notable because going back to proper Middle Ages, or kind of the High Middle Ages, people like to call it. Like I say, the terminologies are a mess for this. The way in which you're having uh, these three are um, organized into kind of guilds, or in London, these are the great livery companies. You get the colleges of physicians, college of surgeons in places like London and Edinburgh and Glasgow, um, being formed, and these are kind of protection rackets, and they're about excluding people who aren't part of the club, so they can't charge the same fees. So we know quite a bit about them because they set down their bylaws in writing, and a lot of those survive. And one of the main sources we have in English history, particularly going back to when we don't have ridiculously large numbers of sources, is court case files and records, court records. And people were really litigious, and so people would so we have court cases of people being done for claiming to be something they're not because they're not a guild member, or equivalent of guild. That's guild. So we're using guild with a small g rather than guild with a big G, I guess. So the fourth group that's generally talked about is the kind of others or unlicensed practitioners, although much good a license did you. And these could be anything ranging from a kind of a hedge healer type, hedge wizard almost, to a herbalist, to a wise man or a cunning man or a wise woman or a cunning woman. And as I think I've said, there's a understandings of anything that's remotely to do with sort of science as it might relate to health and things is just not there at this stage. So there is a much more of an overlap between religion, because religion is a much beefier part of life, in the sense that in those times it was known that God created things. It was just known. That was just a bald fact. A bit like the sky was often blue when it wasn't grey. I am talking mostly about England. The ground was mostly mud. Water is wet. These things are just known. God created things. So God created the problems as well. You then get kind of the more grey area, mysticism, magic, which is kind of where we put our where we think there might be some degree of negotiation with powers we don't really understand. So you've got religion, which is faith, but maybe God's too important to be bothered, or I've somehow annoyed this deity. Whether you're a monotheist or a polytheist, obviously in England in these times they're all monotheists, but generally, so that's religion. Magic and mysticism is kind of the unknown bits, and where there might be some degree of, maybe I can entice the higher powers to do what I want. And that's where you get all your rituals, like touching wood and all those sorts of things. I do actually have something wooden next to me, but it's out of shot, so I thought I would do my usual tapping of the head. And then you get the science as they understood it, which comprised kind of you've got the four elements. There's arguments as to whether or not there's things like phlogiston and other stuff. You get miasma theories of disease. You get this four humor model. It's just all a bit when it comes to, and so when we talk about the Egyptian priesthood healers who would do all these things, it seems, wow, that's so ancient and backward. Yet, not that long ago, if you went to see an eminent physician, they would be taking your star chart and then might say that the reason why you are unwell is because you've annoyed God and it's a punishment for your wicked ways, and that means that you've got an imbalance of the humours. So the way to treat this is to let out some of your blood, possibly give you lots and lots of things to make you sick, or poo all your guts out. In the hopes that that will kind of remedy things. I mean, it's really not that different, actually. I'm going to avoid commentary on how much of what we do in the modern world is based on such rituals and things, because that's a bit dodgier. Now there's an elephant in the womb here. Sorry, deliberate pun. Couldn't help myself. So the first three, the ones which are the three groups of healers, whatever, that you might see who are that I mentioned, so the apothecaries, the physicians, the surgeons, they are going to be they're going to basically be exclusively male preserves, and they're all probably going to be in towns and urban settings. The fourth grouping, which is the everything else, isn't really a fourth grouping, but we'll go there. It is thought, and as I say, the ways that we know this are from prosecutions and things like that, might be about 25% women. 25% of them might be women. But the elephant in the room is that there are two huge groups which we know naff all about because they do not appear in the written records. And that is midwives, midwifery, all of that sort of thing. We just know very little about it. And when male physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, whatever, started to get involved, they were not recording what was happening. It's a bit like trying to understand the native Celtic peoples or the natives of kind of the native Britons or the native Celts from the way that they were written about by the Romans, or trying to understand the indigenous or native cultures in Central and South America from what the Spanish conquistadors wrote down. It's just not a good interpretation, and they went in and they were basically highly critical of it, and had a very different lens. So midwifery we know very little about, but we also know that it will have happened because humans are badly designed in terms of the reproductive things. Now, I've clearly not had a baby, but they only just fit coming out. And if you look at something like a little baby lamb that comes out of a sheep and then within moments is up and gamboling around and running around and doing things, human babies apparently don't do that for really quite a long time. So, yeah. But also they don't necessarily come out all that easily, and generally people will often want some assistance generally around that, and that's midwives. So we don't know much about them. The other thing is the idea of any sort of family remedies and those sorts of things, they would have been very much the preserve of the women, it seems, in the kind of family units, because we think they did the majority of the cooking and the sort of preparation of these things. They made your ale at home. We'll come on to ale. And all those sorts of things. So those things, and again, not going to have been written down. They will have just gradually passed out of use over generations. What is life going to be like? You are going to work hard. It is all going to be hard. It is all going to be physical. And you're going to be governed by natural light. And if you're in towns, there is almost certainly going to be a curfew after dark. So again, you need to have a very good reason to be out and about. They will often close city gates and things, or town gates, and things like that. The idea of a gendered workforce is much less than it probably is, much less than we probably think it was. I think what happened was that we had people operating family units, and those family units would have as the nominal head the man, and the woman in the partnership of this family would be what's the right way of putting it? She would be more domestic focused, possibly. There is a good chance that she will have spent, as a woman in this era, you will spend pretty much your entire adult life pregnant or breastfeeding, which does at least stand some chance of reducing your chances of getting pregnant again. So you may well not want to be or be able to get as far away. And so you have that division, but actually you're all going to be working the fields when you're needed. If you have a trade, you may well be doing that, but also the woman is going to be doing a lot of domestic tasks that we have all automated now. So that's things like brewing your own ale and things. So yeah, it's going to be tough whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, whether you're in a town, whether you're in the countryside. I'm just going to pause for a second here, which probably you won't notice, but I don't know. Right. This is the disadvantage of not having any editing software or anything. I actually can't remember where I'd got up to before this. What for you will be a seamless pause, although see if you can spot what's changed. So, working hard, women working alongside the men, but everyone just working really hard. Only really able to work in daylight, natural light. You are going to be you're not going to drink water. Water is bad. Water is bad. Maybe if you collected some rainwater, you might be able to drink it, but really water bad. You drink ale, or small beer, it's sometimes called. I believe technically it's an ale because it doesn't have hops in. It's basically slightly fermented wheat-based stuff. And it's only going to be a couple of percent alcohol, but that's enough to render it fairly sterile, clean. So it's not going to have all the nasty bugs in it. So what are the other things that are going to be fairly standard through these things? You're going to go to church, and you're going to be part of a fairly small social group, but you're going to know a lot about each other, and there's a huge amount of bureaucracy and local government actually in this time. People are organised down to a level of kind of 10 or so working households. So they talk about the men, but each of them will come with a family unit. So you get down as small as that. One thing that might change is interesting. I don't think things are going to change when you kind of go from Catholic to Protestant, and then back again, and then yeah. But you will stop having to work out how to use a longbow on your days off, and probably start doing either musket or pike drill or something. Now, sailors' lives. How to say this? Right. I don't know anything about fishermen and the fishing industries. Not going to talk about that. Before, how to put this? How to say this so that I'm going to be at least roughly right in my generalization. A massive game changer, or thing which had not really been done before, was during the 7 Years' War. That's the Europe. Well, it's actually the kind of the European Atlantic campaign bits of the French and Indian Wars. In about late 1850s probably. You have the British blockade of France following the Battle of Quiberon Bay, under Admiral Hawke, and that is, for want of a better term, revolutionary, because the ships stay at sea all year. It's never been done before. And so that's really the start of things changing, I think. That's the big change. It feels exceptional that Columbus spent 29 days without sighting land, sailing from the Canary Islands to end up in bits of the Americas. You generally didn't go that far. Navigation wasn't that good, and you just weren't doing it. And it was then a couple of years of doing this blockade work that kind of changed that. And although it had been difficult, particularly for Europeans going round West Africa, the coastline doesn't have that many places to anchor and get fresh water and things. But staying at sea for months at a time was not something people were doing until this, without kind of touching land to do something. And suddenly, by about 1800 or so, late 18th century, it's fairly normal for the Royal Navy or British merchant ships to sail from Britain to India, the long way round of Africa, of course, because there's no Suez Canal, taking 6 months and never make no landfall. They don't land. They don't the entire way. They all get scurvy and die, but that's different. Only about 25% of them do. But actually, by that stage, by about 1800, they've figured out that they're losing lots of people to scurvy. I will do another video on scurvy. Um, they've realised they're losing lots of people to scurvy, and they're trying to do something about it. Because they've clearly been doing this enough that they've observed something. So what's going to be different about being a sailor? You are going to work hard. You are going to have not brilliant food. You are going to be mostly drinking alcohol, albeit not very strong alcohol. So what's different about this? It's a 24/7 existence, life. You don't just go home to bed when it gets dark. Apparently, the ship is still at sea. I know it's a shock to all of us. So the ship is still at sea overnight, and so at least some of you have to be awake and doing things like, I don't know, keeping an eye on sails, or I don't really know what they did. Mostly, I think, keeping an eye on the sails, and so you might sleep, but be the ones who are going to get called. You might be on watch because navigation wasn't that great, and you might accidentally hit an island or something. It's an incredibly male existence. I know that we hear about sort of, a few women here. There might have been sort of 3, 4, 5 women on board Victory with a crew of 800 or so at the Battle of Trafalgar. It's not a significant number. It's a very male environment. But I don't think there's much to read into that, because although I've said just before that you have you have very gendered roles and expectations in society, but it's not that the women aren't working. That is a conceit of it's really a middle class conceit, actually, to be wealthy enough that the women don't need to work. Because noble women worked bloody hard, because what they were doing was often running the household. And if you think organising something the size of a medieval house, or after that household, is a simple task, yeah, it sounds like it's a continuous wedding planning thing. It sounds terrible. Sorry. Food. Probably. So we all get horrified by the idea of the food. And you've got the ship's tack, you've got the hard tack, full of weevils. Well, what do you expect? There's no pesticides. It's organic. You get cheese, because cheese lasts, and you're going to get preserved meats, and they preserve things by salting it. So it's all salt beef, salt pork, salt. Mostly just those two, I think. But actually, that's actually really similar to what a lot of the common folk would have been eating out of season, because it's what can you preserve in these times before there's any way of preserving stuff other than alcohol and salt, really. I mean, they don't have enough sugar to put stuff in sugar. You can bake bread, and if you bake it long enough and hard enough, it'll be harder for the weevils to get into, but that's as much because they don't want to have bread ovens on a wooden ship for some reason. It's bad enough having a small ship's galley, but can you imagine having a huge baking oven on board ship? I now have visions of an Italian warship with a pizza oven on it, which is a wonderful image, but probably not helpful. I'm sure there will also be some Norse sort of broadly Norsemen who would quite like to have a sauna on their longboat. I don't think these are practical. That's why they would have had ship's hardtack, and you boil down the salt beef. I think that's a lot of what poor folk, common folk would have had out of season when there's no fresh stuff to be had. And yes, if it was a particularly long, bad season, you'd get scurvy on land. Because unfortunately, their ways of preserving things pretty much guarantees destroying vitamin C. What else? There's no privacy, but no one's got any privacy anywhere anyway. Privacy is a very modern notion. Again, I think it's I don't know when modern concepts of privacy arose, but yeah, I think it's kind of the exception rather than the rule, and we tend to just view everything through the lens of modern things without realizing it. And I think this is one of those examples. So the fact that you have very little space and you're all crammed in, well, guess what life was like at home probably for you in your little hut, hovel, or whatever. You were probably squeezed in together in not too dissimilar a way. Press gangs, actually, press gangs aren't interested in getting landmen, untrained people. They're after experienced sailors, and it's partly to do with the kind of comes and goes nature of warfare at the time, which I'll come on to that when I talk about actually why you might join the Navy. So why would you join the Navy? Well, if your family has had a run of bad luck, or possibly even good luck, in that too many sons survived, and you're there, you're a bright young lad. Sorry, ladies. You're a bright young lad, and there's just too many mouths at home for the size of farm that you all live on. What are you going to do? Well, there's this place where they'll feed you every day. You'll get a proper meal, and they'll pay you. And there's a chance of riches. Sound good? Regular food. Get paid a bit. Not much. It's not bad though. Especially considering your food and things are mostly paid for. Yeah, it's not that terrible an idea. Life is hard in these times. There is no easy option. Again, we look at things like HMS Victory and we go, oh, that's a really hard life. There were no easy options at this point unless you were mega rich. Sorry. Life was not easy. There was not security. So, yeah, you get plenty of food. Might not be good, but, was it that great at home? You get some pay. There's a chance of riches. So, if you join the army, you're effectively signed up for life. It's kind of a ridiculously long period of service, in the order of decades. The way things work with ships is that and this is kind of why we have stone frigates as a kind of legacy of this. A sailor is only subject to naval law. You're only in the Navy whilst you're on the books of a commissioned ship. The ship is only commissioned when it's actually being crewed up and going out and doing something. When it gets back, it will probably decommission. It'll then be, handed over for it might not be needed for a while. It might need a refit. It might need this, that, the other, and so you would be discharged, and you would then if you wanted to stay in the Navy, you'd find another ship to join. Or at that point, you could go off, you could go home to the farm. You could join the merchant service. And that's the point when the merchant service might then lose you, because the merchant service is better paid, and there's the opportunity to, do a little bit of trading on the side, with your kind of personal allowances and things. But you can make money that way. And then when there's another war, the Navy doesn't really have reserves. They just go, we'll take some of the sailors off that merchant ship, and you can then recruit some new people and train them. And yeah, we'll have those guys off you because we actually need sailors who know what they're doing, and they almost certainly will have spent time in the Navy already, if that makes sense. Those are the ones who are at risk of press gangs. But it's kind of just part of the nature of the beast, which is also why the British really wouldn't have paid much attention to American claims that these people who were kind of born in Britain, had served in the Royal Navy, had then left the Navy either deserting or discharged, then weren't still British. It's closer to America actually actively aiding draft dodging rather than anything else. And you could, as well as just being a seaman, you could learn a trade. You could become a carpenter, a boatswain, a sailmaker, a gunner. You could become a petty officer. You could become a warrant officer. The gunner, the carpenter, the sailmaker, the shipwright, these were all warrant officers. They'd come up through the ranks. They were skilled in a trade. Very much an apprenticeship model. I believe the ship's masters were like that, but I'm not entirely sure, and I may be basing quite a lot of this on my recollections of reading the Hornblower books rather than actual history. But so you had prospects as well. And the main problems with this happened when the conditions on ships didn't keep pace with changing expectations and aspirations of the working class. And that was very much towards the end of the Victorian era, because I know it looks like it's a really terrible job being a stoker on a pre-dreadnought, let's say, shoveling coal. What's your option on land? You might be a miner. Significantly more chance of a cave-in, and actually quite possibly a higher chance of drowning than the sailor. And you're dealing with the same damn coal. Just having to actually hack it out of the earth. You could be on a farm. Nobody thinks farmers have an easy time of it, except possibly deluded royalty. What else could you be doing? You could be working in a factory. Brilliant. That looks so much fun. Throughout the Victorian era. Yeah, it's not that bad. The shift happens kind of around, I reckon it's probably from about 1900 to 1920, give or take, that there's a big change in people's expectations, aspirations, all those sorts of things, and the Navy struggles to keep up. It's had this sort of problem in the past where, it's literally spent centuries without a pay rise, but there wasn't quite the same sort of inflation and things. So that, in a nutshell, is an attempt to say, what are the challenges of being, at sea, on a farm, or in a town or a city, going through the ages when those would have been your kind of options if you're English. Now, oh, what would be some national kind of differences? So quite a lot of places didn't have big organized navies. They would almost all have some sort of merchant navy because until you get the railway, literally the only way of transporting large quantities of goods, any sort of distance, with any sort of efficiency, is on water. So there will be people doing that, whether you are China or uh, Scandinavia or anywhere. This is in some ways the difference with Africa. The rivers in Africa, um, many of them are not as navigable as easily moving up. There's more waterfalls and things apparently, and that's one of the reasons why it was harder. But certainly, if you're on the coast, yeah, people will be trading. So the array of what today we would probably call nationalities, languages spoken, colors of skin, places where people were born in the kind of 18th and early 19th century Royal Navy was just crazy. People would just move around and do different things. It was just the way things happened. So you could have come from somewhere else, and working the land was going to be fairly similar wherever you were. And the towns are probably going to be fairly similar, and you'll have your differences to some extent. And it may be that as a country you can grow things which we can't in Britain, let's say. So very few vineyards in Britain. So wine is more expensive because it has to be imported. But we have a lot of land that's only really good for rearing sheep on, so we made lots of wool. We then sold the wool to the Low Countries, Flanders and things, and then would often then take that back and trade it with the sort of further round into France, sort of Burgundy sort of region, Aquitaine in the Middle Ages, as was for wine, which would then come back to Britain. So there was kind of a triangle of trade because, yeah, Britain's never had anything to do with Europe, like totally not. Sorry, that's a different rant. Anyway, this has been a completely weird thing to try and do. I have no idea if it's what was wanted. It's just such a huge topic, and whilst I wanted to get in some history of medicine stuff, it was also it's also just about kind of thinking about how actually the working life of a common common folk changed relatively little over the course of many centuries. Okay, your plough might be pulled by a horse instead of an ox, but it's still a big lumbering quadruped. You might no longer have to do longbow practice every Sunday. Yeah, the changes are surprisingly small. And I think when you're looking at all those kinds of types of work, the Navy doesn't seem that bad. And this, I think, is where I have a really weird bias because I am middle class urban to the core. And I will be honest, I look at the conditions that sailors in today's ships go in, and I am not sure I would cope with having that small an amount of space for me and my stuff, and relatively lack of privacy because I've always had my own bedroom. When I was growing up and things, I have shared a bedroom with a significant other, but that's pretty much it. Yeah, I don't know if I would cope even today, let alone, shove me in a fairly small wooden ship with 800 other people. But then again, I don't think I'd survive very well on a farm. Again, either today or a couple of hundred years ago. I don't know. I'm just too middle class and urban, and yeah, sorry. Also, remember, not a historian, not even an amateur historian. I'm an amateur at being an amateur historian. I think I've decided that's going to be my tag. Making this stuff up as I go along. So, hope you've enjoyed that. If you want to find proper historians or things of proper historical interest, I recommend. Well, what do I recommend? Oops. This book is good, and I believe there are others like it in the series. Alex Clark, very good. His historian, does proper naval history. It's how I've kind of got into doing this stuff. I found him through Drachenfell, who is more an engineer than a historian, but he does a very good impression of a historian for an engineer. And there are lots of other really good things. So military history visualized, military aviation history, military history not visualized. I've not met either of them. I have met Drachenfell and Alex Clark, which is quite cool. And there's Dr. Cat. She's awesome. And then if you go hunting around on the YouTubes, there's lots of other content, and there's people who just have lots of the programs they've done have appeared. So Alice Roberts, Susanna Lipscomb, the British Museum's got some good output, good stuff going on. It's not really related to this, but the Battleship New Jersey have a lovely amount of output with all of this, especially with COVID and everything happening. And they've got some videos where they've gone and visited other museum ships, including a US wooden sloop, which is, I think, in the same sort of area as them, around the kind of New Jersey, Philadelphia boundary. I've not been to these areas. They are a mystery to me. Sorry, I'm rambling. I will stop now. So, I don't really believe anyone's going to get to this point. Bye bye. Thank you. If you, on the off chance you have, thank you and bye bye. And do make requests for new content, and I will try to make it a bit more focused and less me rambling. Thank you. Bye.